Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's FCICA webinar. My name's Billy. I'm with Freestone, and I'll be producing today's session. Before we begin, I'd like to run through just a few housekeeping items. First, I'd like to go over the audio options for today's webinar. In order to listen, we do recommend that you listen over your computer speakers. So please make sure your speakers are turned on and that your volume is turned up. If you do need to dial into the webinar at any time today, you will find the dial-in information listed in the lower left portion of your screen. Next, I'd like to discuss Q&A for today. We will be addressing your questions during today's presentation, and you are welcome to type your questions in at any time. If you'd like to ask a question today, please click on the Q&A tab at the top side of your screen. You'll type your question in the box and hit the Submit button to register it. And finally, of course, as is true with any web technology, the webinar is only as good as your internet connection. If you do have any technical difficulties, your best bet is to close all of your browsers and log back into the webinar the same way you did the first time. And with that, I think we are ready to begin. I'd like to throw the floor over to Christine from FCICA to begin today's presentation.
Hello and welcome to the FCICA webinar series. Thank you for joining us. This webinar will be recorded. The recorded session will be housed on the FCICA Member Center and this educational portal. Mark your calendars for these upcoming webinars. Thursday, November 18, Incorporating Subfloor Materials into Sustainable Design, presented by Shane Jenkins with Shonox HPS North America. And on Thursday, December 9, how do high moisture resistant products work in high moisture conditions, and how can they still fail? Presented by Jeff Johnson with MAPE Corporation. Visit FCICA.com to view and register for these events. FCICA's Safety Book, Start with Safety, is available electronically free to members, and printed versions are available for $185. The Safety Book is an essential item to have in your office and on every job site. Purchase it on FCICA's website today. Thank you for joining us for From Design to Diagnosis, Understanding Commercial Flooring Issues. We are pleased to introduce our presenter, Graham Capobianco. Graham is a fifth-generation flooring veteran who has a diverse background and range of experience. Over the past 14 years, Graham has worked in sales and technical positions for manufacturers of cork, rubber, vinyl, polymers, and adhesives. As a self-proclaimed flooring nerd, Graham has accrued a wealth of knowledge regarding concrete, moisture mitigation, substrate repair, flooring adhesives, and flooring selection. He provides impactful solutions and an overall better experience when working with contractors, designers, and end users on commercial projects. Welcome, Graham. We're excited to have you. I'm going to turn the controls over to you.
Thanks, Christine. Thanks also everyone attending. Thanks for carving some time out of your day to talk about the one thing we probably don't want to talk about, which is flooring issues. As Christine said, my name is Graham. And one thing I do want to draw on from my experiences, I've spent over the last 7 years dealing with commercial flooring claims, and that informs a lot of the content for and the pictures of the presentation today. Anyway, by the end of this course, you should be able to understand the cause of common flooring issues in commercial environments, understand the effects of site conditions on flooring materials, understand how to incorporate project conditions into flooring selection, and understand how to avoid commercial flooring issues using design best practices. And I understand that most of the people on this call will be coming from the perspective of the contractor. And this is a presentation that I normally give to architects and designers to try to inform them of what they need to do on their end. But I've tweaked this presentation to be more focused on the contractor angle of things and what you can do to avoid common commercial flooring issues within your control. So first we're going to review some common flooring issues, but before we do that, I like to take some breaks and do some quick Q&A. So, who is the initial decision maker in the event of a claim? give you a couple of seconds to think about that. Because according to the general conditions of the contract and according to AIA A201, the architect is the initial decision maker in the event of a claim. They're the ones that decide whether a claim should be filed, and they're the ones that should really be driving the claim in a commercial environment. So just something to keep in mind, although contractors usually are the ones that end up filing the claim with the manufacturer because they're the purchaser, usually rely on per the contract, the architect is the one that really is supposed to be driving that. Anyway, so some of the common commercial flooring issues we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about surface damage, discoloration, dimensional change, restriction of movement, which is mainly talking about click and floating floors, indentation, telegraphing, adhesive bonding issues, and substrate flatness issues, which we're going to talk about a lot through all of these. So one thing I want to point out is we're not going to talk about manufacturing defects because they don't exist. No, just kidding. It's because you could have another whole presentation on that. And from my perspective, that's not something that's within the control of any contractor. A commercial product defect is an entirely different issue, and there's nothing a contractor or even an architect or a designer can do to avoid those. That's on us, the manufacturers. And I also want to point out there's probably some blind spots that I have. This is only I try to keep this to 45 minutes for this presentation. So I'm mainly drawing on my experience with various different products over the last 7 years, focusing on what the most common issues that I see as someone who handles commercial product claims. So the first one we're going to talk about is surface damage. So the first source is gouging or sharp objects, dragging furniture or equipment, dirt or debris under shoes. Obviously, this is not a majority of the time is not a manufacturing defect. This is a site issue, but this is a pretty obvious one. I don't think there's any question about who's to blame and how to avoid this. But this is a big one. This is improper or dirty floor protection is a really big issue, and it's something that I see a lot in commercial environments, keeping in mind that we consider education a commercial environment and multifamily is usually installed by commercial contractors. So we do consider that a commercial installation. And usually it's because it's improper floor protection in the case of having no protection at all, which on the bottom right, that's just metal, or the floor protection for the specific piece of furniture is nylon or hard plastic. The picture on the far left, that was in an elementary school, and it was in a kindergarten classroom where they had the wobble chairs to, keep the kids stimulated while they're learning. And the problem is wobble chairs are plastic. They pick up dirt and debris that the kids track in from outside, and it basically becomes sandpaper. And if you see the purple one on top that's flipped upside down, you can see it almost looks like sandpaper. But the other thing, and then in the top right, that's a very common floor protector for metal chairs. The problem is it's hard plastic, and a lot of times, especially if LVT is being used in the space, they're not, or really any product that doesn't have a finish on it and has a higher coefficient of friction, that nylon a lot of times is going to be weaker than the surface of the flooring, and it'll get chewed up and it'll actually transfer to the surface of the flooring, and it'll create what looks like scratches, and it's actually an actual transfer of plastic to the surface, and then dirt accumulation. So next, now we're going to move on to discoloration. So the first cause of discoloration is improper maintenance. In some cases, this can be adhesive left behind after installation for glue down installations, or adhesive related to something installed adjacent to the flooring material. But a lot of times, like in the picture on the left, it can be a film left behind from cleaning or disinfection. Important as COVID has, continued through the last year and a half, disinfection has become more common in flooring, and it's important to realize that you have to clean before you disinfect. And if you don't, you're just layering disinfectant on top of it. And The picture on the left is an example of when a film builds up onto the floor, and then this was the discoloration that you see is actually from rubber tires from a hand truck that was spun in that spot. And it cleaned right off once it was actually cleaned. But another source that we see of discoloration is film from drywall dust. It's really important to protect floors when there's wall work being done. After a lot of times, the walls are being painted or corrected after flooring installation. And gypsum dust is very fine. It is a calcium salt, so it's very, very easily miscible in water. And if you're just trying to damp mop the floor, what can happen is it basically spreads the gypsum dust all over the floor and creates a haze. And we'll get claims sometimes we're saying this floor is hazy, or it's not the right color, or something along those lines. And it's actually just a film of gypsum dust on the surface, which is very difficult to remove. Another source of discoloration is sunlight and UV or IR rays, which will cause eventual fading in most floors over time, but it's really natural products that are especially susceptible. The picture on the left is cork. The dark color in the bottom left-hand side is the original color. What's in the most of the rest of the picture is what happens when you have 6 years of direct sunlight exposure with no window treatment and no window films. So cork and wood as well, though that's not a resilient floor, and we're going to be focusing on resilient flooring. It can happen in wood. It can happen in cork, happen in linoleum. And the picture on the right is a rubber tile. The interesting thing is that in rubber, a lot of times UV exposure actually darkens the tile. And in that case, the darker area is the area that was exposed to sunlight. This was flooring that was opened on the job site, sat out in direct sunlight for a while they were finishing up something else, and then they came back and it was discolored. So another source, a rare source of discoloration, is chemical attack. This can be from foot traffic, like a lack of, really falls down to a lack of walk-off mats. That's why most commercial manufacturers mention having walk-off mats, not just for, we talked about tracking in rocks and stuff in your shoes that can cause scratches and gouges on the surface. But, in the picture on the left is, you see the darkened area to the right. That's from a freshly paved asphalt parking lot. There was no walk-off mats in the building because the architect didn't like them. And the asphalt attacked the flooring on the surface and discolored it, and that's permanent. But you can also have chemical attack from underneath. And the picture on the right is VCT tile that was being attacked from a high pH in the substrate caused by a waterproofing admixture. But there can be all sorts of contamination in the substrate that can attack products, especially vinyl, but even rubber. Anything that's not compatible with the flooring material that's in the substrate can obviously lead to issues. And then abrasive or caustic chemical usage, that's kind of obvious. If you're going to use a really abrasive chemical, if it's in a laboratory, or in a healthcare setting, obviously that's going to lead to discoloration and potential chemical attack. So now we move on to dimensional change. And dimensional change is an issue that can affect all flooring types, not just floating floors, but also glue down floors. And click is we're seeing click being used in commercial environments more and more. In fact, 10 minutes before this presentation, one of our sales reps sent out some pictures to a big group of us of a recent installation in a healthcare setting where they had put, it was outpatient healthcare, but still they had click through the whole healthcare office. So click is becoming a lot more common in commercial environments. And I'm going to touch on click a bunch because of that, because we do see more problems with click than anything else. But anyway, dimensional change, which there's two sides of that coin. There's expansion and contraction. First is contraction. Usually what causes flooring materials to contract is a dramatic decrease in temperature, or in the case of cork, humidity. this particular issue is especially common in the Northeast and the Midwest, where you have, very large swings in temperature from summer to winter. But it can also happen if the material isn't properly acclimated. And again, this happens more often than the summer months. But if the flooring isn't acclimated or the space isn't acclimated, in the case of the flooring not being acclimated, if you're taking flooring from a very hot environment and bringing it into a space that's properly acclimated but is much cooler, the flooring is going to contract if it hasn't acclimated and reach some sort of equilibrium with the actual temperature in the space. So you can have the flip side of that, where flooring is stored, maybe the flooring is stored in a place that has better conditions, but the actual space it's being installed in is colder than where it was being stored. That can lead to contraction. So, but the other thing that can lead to contraction is restriction of movement. Well, and it's natural contraction, but it leads to gapping. And this is in floating floors mostly. But that could be caused by heavy fixed furniture or something that's anchored through the floating floor into the subfloor. So on the other side of that coin, from dimensional change, would be expansion, which usually results in buckling. And same thing, ambient conditions, but it's usually a dramatic increase in temperature. The picture on the left was from an installation, it's a glue down installation. They were storing the flooring in about 19 degrees at that particular time. And the installers had the HVACs in the units, or the heating set to 80. So it was going from 19 to 80 and getting installed immediately. Obviously, it was expanding over time and it was leading to some buckling issues. But this can obviously also happen in click, especially if there are any areas where perimeter expansion isn't being honored, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. But subfloor obstructions can also cause that. I was at a job recently where the end user didn't want to pay for the prep it would take to properly prepare a difference in height between two concrete pours. And it was actually that they ran the flooring in the direction of that joint, and it was restricting the natural movement of the flooring. So subfloor obstructions, but also existing flooring, or if you're going directly over a pressure sensitive adhesive, something that's very sticky, that can also restrict the movement of flooring, not allow it to move over a long space. The flooring, the planks themselves, especially in a floating floor, are going to expand. If they don't have room to move, or if the planks near them can't move with them, then that will lead it to buckle up. And then improper expansion gap, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. Oh, and adhesive bonding issues, that's another thing. We see this issue especially when weaker pressure sensitive adhesives are used in areas where the flooring is going to receive direct sunlight. Most less expensive pressure sensitive adhesives don't have the ability to help vinyl especially resist dimensional change. Products like rubber are less susceptible to temperature changes. I mean, if you think about it, rubber is often used as an insulator, but all vinyl products are sensitive to temperature changes. And when you have direct sunlight, that can heat vinyl products up to 120 degrees. And if the adhesive doesn't have the ability to help the LVT resist that natural dimensional change, that can also cause buckling as it moves, especially if it's large south-facing windows or really any window that's seeing significant sunlight exposure that's heating the floor. And then improper expansion. So restriction of movement is a very common issue in floating floors, and a lot of it, most of the time, it's due to an improper expansion gap, which all floating floors need, because you have to think of a floating floor as a gigantic tile, because everything is connected. And that tile is going to move as temperature conditions change, and it might change. I've seen installations where I get to the job site and they say, oh, the product's not as bad as it was in the picture. And that's because I came early in the morning before it had received a lot of direct sunlight. Floating floors are going to move around. You'll more than likely not notice it ever unless you restrict the natural movement of the floor. So not allowing for expansion, there's usually expansion required around the entire perimeter and any vertical surface. So if you've got a kitchen island in a multifamily environment or some sort of heavy desk in a commercial environment, that would be restricting movement as well. It's supposed to have expansion around that. Glass partition walls are a common thing, and obviously there's not going to be a transition or wall base installed against that partition, and nobody wants to see a gap there. But then also all floating floors have a maximum area or length that they can be installed in, because thinking about it as a gigantic tile, the locking mechanisms all have a certain strength to them as far as how much pressure it can withstand before it will separate and pull apart. And you have to keep in mind, especially with thicker click floors, is the weight of the flooring factors into it. And I've seen it, especially in the picture in the bottom right, was a very large installation of an older HDF core click and lock product, where it was installed in a 120-foot run, and it was a thick product, and it, basically as it was expanding and contracting, once it was in the contracting phase, it separated. It was almost like a straight line as the joint staggered, where the flooring, I always say, created its own expansion joint, which is what flooring is, what click is going to eventually do if you don't give it the right expansion space that it needs. But another source is anchoring to or through flooring. So obviously, the picture on the left, if you're going to drill a bolt into the concrete or the plywood through the floating floor, that floor is not going to move, and that it can cause buckling or it can cause gapping. It's hard to see in that picture, but it was causing buckling in this case up against where the flooring was anchored. But then also transitions, and this is a big problem with floating floors in commercial environments, is nobody wants an overlap, and everybody wants as minimal a transition as possible. And a lot of times with a traditional rubber or vinyl reducer or T-mold or something, actually more reducers, some contractors say, well, I didn't want to glue the flooring to it, so I glued it to the top of the flooring. If you use a real strong adhesive, in this case, they used a construction adhesive, so it was a really strong urethane adhesive. You just glued all of those planks together, which a lot of times they're clicked together anyway. But if it's going widthwise or if it's a large section, it basically traps all of those planks and prevents them from moving independently. But the other thing too is, just as a side note, is a lot of times those vinyl and rubber transitions, they don't allow for expansion because they weren't designed for floating floors. They were designed for floors that are glued down. So a lot of times what can happen too is they can actually push. I've seen it tons of times where it just pushes the transition right up off the floor if you don't have proper expansion. All right, so now we're going to focus on indentation, which has a few different causes. And the first one I'm going to touch on is adhesive displacement. This is in a LVT, sheet vinyl, a lot of vinyl applications nowadays. Most of the time, the adhesive being used is a pressure sensitive or a transitional, whatever you want to call it. It's usually dry. So this is not necessarily an issue that you're going to see a ton in vinyl, but a lot of rubber flooring products and specialty flooring products require a wet set adhesive to work correctly. So believe it or not, it's still an issue that comes up every once in a while in vinyl as well. But usually when you're dealing with wet adhesive that's causing actual indentation, it's because the open time or flash time for the adhesive wasn't honored. there's too much adhesive and it's taking too long to cure, it's incompatible with the substrate, or there's concrete moisture and pH issues. And the picture on the left is a cafeteria where it was going over a moisture mitigation product, which great. They found they had high moisture. It was higher than the adhesive would tolerate, so they did the right thing. They put down moisture mitigation to cover them. And the adhesive they used was not approved for a non-porous substrate, and it never dried. And you can see the lines from where the cafeteria tables were moved around for maintenance and all sorts of stuff. It was telegraphing right through, and you pulled up a tile, the adhesive was totally wet. But another thing is that adhesive might not be rated for the traffic. And the picture on the right is a typical acrylic adhesive that was used in a hospital setting where there were Hill-Rom beds. And Hill-Rom beds, or any, Hill-Rom is a brand, really any heavy hospital bed, they're extremely heavy. A lot of times they sit in one place for a long period of time. And if you have an adhesive that, especially if the trowel notch is above a 32nd of an inch, there's a really good chance that the weight of that equipment is going to cause the adhesive to displace under it, even when it's dry. So that's one reason why a lot of times there's different adhesive requirements in areas where Hill-Rom beds are going to be used. And it's for that reason to prevent adhesive displacement. So another source of indentation is heavy point loads. And a lot of times it's improper footwear. It's kind of a weird topic. It comes up every once in a while where somebody's got indentations in material caused by stiletto heels, and we say, look, we specifically, most manufacturers specifically call out, don't allow sharp pointed objects like stiletto heels to come in contact with the flooring. The picture on the right is an LVT. The picture on the left is a cork floor. Obviously, cork is really soft. You might expect that. LVT might not, but you have to keep in mind that, a stiletto heel, yeah, maybe the person that's wearing them is light, but you have to factor in the actual flat contact point with the floor. So if you've got an 1/8 inch contact point with the floor and you're 100 pounds, that's 800 pounds of pressure if they're leaning on that, especially if they're leaning on that heel for any reason. I don't know why they would do that, but, and obviously that compounds the heavier the person gets. But it can also be a problem for spikes, which is really mainly a baseball issue. Most other sports aren't using spikes anymore. But also ice skates. I mean, anything that's going to put a heavy load in a small area, or even a normal load in just a smaller contact point, it will lead to an indentation in almost any flooring, other than maybe polished concrete or hard surface tile. Another source of indentation is improper underlayment. So this is mainly a multifamily thing, but you do see it in commercials sometimes where for sound reduction reasons, a separate sound control underlayment is being used. And most resilient flooring manufacturers have specific requirements for how thick that underlayment can be, what it's made out of. There are some restrictions there. And the reason is the thicker the underlayment gets, the lower the indentation resistance of the flooring gets, especially, and the thicker the flooring, the worse that's going to be. So it's really important, in these kinds of scenarios to make sure that the underlayment is rated for the traffic, but also if it's at the right thickness, because, when you get into 5 millimeters, 10 millimeters, the indentation resistance of that flooring goes down significantly. And as you can see in this picture, those indentations were from what I would consider a standard hotel chair foot. It was 7/8 of an inch in radius. It was a little smaller than what we normally recommend, but still what I would consider normal. And it was indenting with very little load. And it was because the underlayment was way too thick for the flooring material. Another source of indentation is improper floor protection. the picture on the left is it looks big, but it's a small foot. That foot was only a 1/4 inch, which is normally most manufacturers require 1 square inch or 1.125, which is 1 1/8 inch in diameter. And that's to properly displace the weight. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the heavier the furniture, I mean, the picture on the bottom right, that was a very heavy pull-out couch. And they had they thought, oh, we'll put 2 feet on every corner. But the problem is those feet only made about an 1/8 inch contact or a 1/4 inch contact point with the floor, which was leading to significant indentation. And then this is kind of a no-brainer, but it does happen when somebody, especially nowadays where in commercial people are replacing carpet with resilient for cleanability reasons and for disinfection reasons. You can't take a carpet chair pad and put it on top of anything soft, really, because it will puncture it. And in that top right picture, you can see that's what happens when you take a carpet chair pad and put it on top of sheet vinyl. It'll literally puncture it. The customer was asking if they could fill in those holes with anything. So obviously you can't. So next is telegraphing. And the majority of the time when you see really bad telegraphing, it has to do with the subfloor. And it's just improper subfloor preparation. I mean, every resilient flooring manufacturer is going to say something along the lines of, make sure you're doing, you're patching low spots. There's going to be flatness requirements. But it's also going to say, make sure the floor is smooth. And if you've got low spots and divots and all kinds of surface damage, like on the left, that's not smooth. Even if it's flat, it's not smooth. So obviously when you have a very flexible flooring product, especially rubber, rubber is extremely flexible and will conform to the substrate almost immediately, faster than vinyl will. But another common problem with telegraphing is existing flooring seams, especially if it's hardwood, which is the picture on the right. That's what happens when you put LVT directly over hardwood flooring. And you install the LVT with a water-based adhesive without ever really patching it. The LVT or whatever flooring product you put over the top is going to trap all that moisture in the wood, and just like it would if there were, a dramatic increase in humidity, it cupped because the moisture had nowhere to go. But this can also happen. I've seen it happen with people going over existing flooring products, like, most patches and adhesives, will let you go directly over VCT. And a lot of people are trying to go over VCT with more interesting looking flooring. But VCT gaps over time. And the other thing too is that you might have spots that are loose. You might have low spots that were never patched to begin with. You still need to fill those seams, and you still need to do your normal prep, because if you're putting a flexible product over the top of existing flooring materials, it will conform to that. Maybe not to the same extent, but you will still see some telegraphing. And then improper adhesive installation. This is not super common, but it does happen. Quick story, picture on the left. I used to live in the Charlotte area. When my kids were in diapers, my wife sent me to Bye Bye Baby to go get some diapers. Walked into the floor and I saw this, and I could see every trowel line in the entire store. So I'm walking through the store like, this is insane. I haven't seen it this bad before. And I'm taking pictures, and a manager came out and said I can't take pictures in the store and kicked me out. So I had to go someplace else. But in this case, this was just a case of the working time was exceeded. It looked to me like the installer troweled the entire floor and then tried to install everything. I don't know if they came back the next day or whatever, but whatever the case may be, it was clear that the working time had exceeded, and the flooring was actually telegraphing the adhesive trowel marks through the floor in the entire store. But another cause of telegraphing, especially in sheet goods on the right, is adhesive overlap. If you have a really long, depending on how you're installing, everybody has their own method, but if you're installing it a sheet at a time, obviously your adhesive is going to go a little past the first sheet while you're installing it, and then you're going to move on to the next sheet. But if that adhesive, if you overlap too much with that adhesive from the roll next to it, then it's going to build up there, especially if it's an adhesive, like it's a transitional or pressure sensitive, it's already dry. So you're not going to be able to trowel into it again. Or even if it's a wet set and it's set up too much where you can't spread it anymore, and then you put more adhesive over the top, that's going to build up. And the picture on the right, and that seam, that's along a seam, and it was all lifted up. And when they opened that up, there was excess adhesive at that seam from when the roll adjacent to it was installed. But another thing is just not rolling it within the allotted time, especially critical with wet set adhesives for rubber products, which a lot of times are installed with the wet set. If you don't roll that adhesive, especially if you've got substrate issues, if it's a little out of tolerance or you've got some low spots and the rubber doesn't get all the way into that adhesive, it could eventually conform and telegraph once the adhesive dries. So there's another source of telegraphing. So another is improper substrate joint repair. And Kelly Mortensen sent me a note in the questions. I was waiting for this slide because this is actually related to stuff being pushed out of expansion, but expansion needs to be honored no matter what. Some people think, oh, it's a floating floor, I can just go directly over it, it's fine. And like Kelly was saying, that's not true. You still need to honor expansion joints even if it's a floating floor, especially because a lot of times a true expansion joint is a joint between two independent concrete slabs that will move independent of each other. And if one is moving differently than the other and there's a height difference there, that could cause a problem for the floating floor because floating floors really need to be flat. Excuse me. But anyway, so when we're talking about joint repair and it actually becoming a telegraphing issue, it's usually because in the case of an expansion joint, which is a picture on the bottom, all manufacturers, if they don't, they should say that you have to honor expansion joints in the concrete because, like I said, it's basically two separate concrete slabs that just happen to be next to each other, and you have to allow those slabs to move independent of each other. Most of the time, you want to use a joint covering system, but there's also flexible repair compounds that you can use. They're usually a little bit more onerous on the installation side, but you have to honor them. You can't fill an expansion joint with patch. You can't fill an expansion joint with a resin. It has to be, a flexible material or a joint covering system. But it can also happen in control cuts and saw cut joints. And typically those joints, we think of as static, but they can continue to move 90 to 120 days after a pour. And if you fill it with a cementitious material and there's still a little bit of movement in that control cut or that saw cut joint, it could push a patch out. It's hard to see in that top picture, but that's what was happening there in the school, is it was pushing the patch out of that joint. And this is caused by natural movement in concrete. That's why, when you're covering wider cracks that are normal cracks in the concrete, you have to use a product that's suitable. So adhesive bonding issues, I'm not going to touch too much on this because I'm sure all of you at some point have sat through a moisture presentation from one manufacturer or another, but it bears repeating just because it is an issue. It doesn't come up as much as it used to, but still does come up. Concrete moisture and alkalinity. If there's not a vapor barrier beneath the slab, especially if it's an old slab, if the adhesive is not capable of resisting pH in the concrete, and there's no moisture mitigation involved, those three things especially will normally lead to adhesive issues like whether it's sheet goods, whether it's tile, it doesn't really matter. It affects everything more or less the same. But another thing is just incorrect usage or incompatible material. So not all adhesives are rated for all products. I don't care if it says multi-purpose. They don't work well for everything. And this test board is a really good example of how different adhesives and different flooring products interact with each other. But, usually when you have a adhesive bonding issue that's due to some incompatibility, it usually means the adhesive isn't suitable for the floor covering. If you look at the pictures on the right, to me, what we look for, that tells me that adhesive is not compatible with that flooring product, or it's not suitable for the substrate. And if you look at from the left, if you look at the first and third picture, that's a good example of it didn't bond to the substrate. And it's a very common in non-porous substrates. So moisture mitigation is a non-porous substrate, fire retardant plywood. There's lots of different green or fast track products that are being introduced in commercial buildings, especially multifamily. A lot of times those are tricky to install to. A lot of times the manufacturers of those actual products say you have to put regular plywood over the top because they know it's hard to bond to, or you have to use a urethane, which is annoying and expensive. So that's another source of adhesive bonding issue. And then a rarer source of adhesive bonding issue is substrate contamination. Again, not super common, but you could have hydrocarbon contamination, especially if it's a building that's being repurposed. If it's an existing commercial building, I've seen maintenance, like heavy equipment maintenance buildings or some sort of vehicle fleet maintenance buildings being repurposed into offices. Oils, grease, fuel, stuff like that, they'll leach into the concrete, and you might clean the surface and think that you're scot clean, but what's underneath is all of those hydrocarbons that will migrate up, especially if there's some moisture. But you can also see hydrocarbon contamination from pipe cutting. So if it's a new construction and you've got somebody in there cutting pipes, especially for overheads for sprinkler systems, but also heating equipment. And then there's also adhesive removers like cutback or asbestos removal. I mean, if you think about it, it's a lot of those products are designed to break down one of the strongest adhesives we've ever known in the flooring industry. And you can imagine what your acrylic going over the top is going to do if that adhesive remover isn't totally removed. But also solvent-based products can also break down adhesives. Most adhesive manufacturers are telling you to use a solvent to clean it off of products. So you can imagine what solvent will do to the adhesive. And then curing compounds or sweeping compounds. Most times curing compounds should be walked off by then, but they can still, some curing compounds can cause issues. And then sweeping compounds, obviously, they're will be a bond breaker for most adhesives. And then finally, excessive topical liquids. There was someone forwarded to me a presentation that was given at Greenbuild this year, and it was a presentation aimed at end users to help them avoid adhesive issues related to cleaning and disinfecting and new cleaning and disinfecting procedures that a lot of healthcare facilities and commercial facilities have put in place. So I thought was interesting and timely, given I was giving this presentation. But this is definitely an issue, especially for acrylic adhesives or adhesives that are not waterproof once they're cured. Excessive cleaning liquid. I was in the military. Picture on the left is obviously a guy in the military. That's how I cleaned every floor. Just get as much liquid as you can get on it, because sometimes you have to wait till it dries before you're done. So, it's a built-in break. But anyway, excessive cleaning liquid, most resilient flooring products will say damp mop only. And that's because the adhesives that they're installed with, if they get enough routine heavy topical water exposure, can lead to adhesive issues. And continuous exposure in wet areas. Not many resilient products are designed for wet areas. Most of them, if they're going in a wet area, should have a waterproof adhesive used, but if it's not, obviously that will cause a problem. I've seen it in commercial bathrooms a lot under the sink, where water usually collects. All right, so now we're going to talk about avoiding common flooring issues from a substrate preparation standpoint. But first, I have a quick polling question. Is product data considered part of the construction contract? Believe it or not, it is not. Unless it's specifically in the contract, Submittals are not technically a part of the contract. They are separate from the contract unless the contract specifically includes product data for whatever reason. That's why it's really important for architects, especially, and design build firms to make sure that they're incorporating a correct prep into it, because they can't fall back on the product data, because product data is not a part of the contract. And anything that augments the contract is a change order, and every contractor loves a change order. Anyway, so I'm going to start for the causes, I went from the top down, from the surface of the flooring to the concrete. So for addressing how to avoid some of those issues, we're going to go the opposite way. We're going to start with the concrete. And obviously, the first thing you should do with concrete is conduct concrete moisture testing and evaluation. And the reason I throw evaluation on there is you might not always need to test. So the first thing you need to do is determine if there's a proper vapor retardant sheet, if it's underneath the concrete, and then determine if concrete moisture if there's requirements for the flooring and or the adhesive, and then conduct moisture testing per that manufacturer's requirements. Not all manufacturers require it anymore. So it's really important, you could have high moisture and go to the manufacturer and say, hey, I've got this, and they might say it's fine. You really have to make sure that you're looking at the manufacturer's requirements. I know you don't always have that ahead of time, or you don't always know which flooring is selected. You might want to go ahead and do moisture testing anyway. It's cheap insurance, and now you know. But once you've done that, or really looking ahead, if you know that you're going to do moisture testing, in case of high moisture, have contingencies in place. Sometimes that might be a part of the actual contract. Sometimes it might not. A lot of times it's not. And then you're scrambling afterwards to try and find a product that's compatible with the flooring and all this. So have a contingency in place ahead of time, especially if the flooring products involved are known to require moisture testing. This may not be the case of floating floors. A lot of floating floors, you just put down a polyethylene sheet and that's it, you're done. But a lot of glue down products are going to have some sort of requirement. It may not be moisture testing. It may be, hey, you need to have a vapor retardant sheet. It needs to be 28 days old. Just make sure you know what those requirements are. Make sure you have a contingency in place. Make sure they work with all of the products, because, scrambling afterwards obviously is not ideal when you're dealing with a moisture issue and you're dealing with construction deadlines. Test the substrate for abnormalities. Substrate flatness is getting worse and worse and worse. Something I almost never dealt with 5 years ago, and now it's extremely common. For whatever reason, a lot of flat work guys are convincing GCs that the flatness can go as bad as an FF of 20, which is like a half inch in 10 feet. That's insane. But the other thing is, with the increase of click products, a lot of people think, oh, well, I don't need to flatten it because I'm using a click product. But the thing is that all rigid core products that comply with the ASTM standard are still flexible. They still have, roughly 30% PVC in them, even though there's other ingredients in it that make it more rigid than a typical sheet vinyl or LVT or rubber. It's still flexible. And if that product flexes due to a deviation in the substrate, it'll eventually break the locking mechanism. Locking mechanisms are not trampolines. They're not designed to bounce. So if they bounce enough, they'll break. So substrate flatness is super important if you're installing click flooring. GC might tell you otherwise. They don't know what they're talking about. So ensure substrate is compatible. So anyway, I jumped ahead a little bit, but you want to make sure the substrate is compatible with the flooring type. That's important with newer substrates, ExoCore, some fire retardant stuff. There's lots of different substrates out there now. Make sure everything is compatible. Conduct porosity testing. Porosity testing is going to tell you a lot of things. First of all, it'll inform you whether there's a contaminant or not. But second of all, it'll affect your adhesive drying times, which could impact your installation time, because acrylic adhesive over a non-porous substrate is going to take longer to flash before you can install into it if you're waiting for it to set up before you can install. So that's going to slow your installation process down. That's good to know ahead of time, because if you're on a crazy deadline and you're waiting an hour for adhesive to set up, that's going to slow you down. So, and then like I said, measure for flatness, whether you're using the straight edge method, whether you're using ASTM E1155, which is giving you a flatness method. Yeah, and Kelly Mortensen said on his side, number one cause of failures in rigid core is improper subfloor flatness. I would say it's 50-50 between improper expansion and subfloor flatness, but it is definitely an issue, and it's definitely something. Luckily, there's been some contractors I've worked with that called it out right away, and I always make it a point after that meeting to say, thank you for calling it out right away. You did everyone a favor of having to deal with this after the fact. But Kelly's absolutely right. So once you've done all that, you've done your moisture testing, you've determined whether the substrate is porous or not, you've determined whether the substrate is within the flatness requirements of the actual flooring product, it's time to repair it. Properly prepare it and repair anything that needs to be repaired. Every flooring product has a flatness requirement. It's easy to test for. It's really easy to determine substrate flatness. As someone who deals with claims, that's an easy claim to deal with, because it's, straight edges don't lie a majority of the time. And usually when there's a problem, it's really bad. It's not like it's an eighth of an inch out of flatness. It's a quarter inch or more. I've seen floors that were as much as an inch out of flatness, and these were newly poured concrete slabs. So anyway, refer to the flooring and adhesive substrate preparation requirements, especially flatness. Remove contaminants if you need to. Fill control cuts and static cracks with an appropriate crack repair material. There's lots of them out there. They're not expensive. The picture in the bottom left is an example. It's a product that you fill, usually you fill it with sand and then you inject this material on it. They dry fast. It's really a no-brainer. And honor all expansion joints. And then use a cementitious compound to flatten all areas to comply with the flooring requirements. Sometimes all that's needed is patch, or all that's specified as patch, or all that's in the budget is patch. Sometimes you can actually level. Whatever you do, make sure you do that prep. Like Kelly said, it's especially in click products, it's a big problem. All right, so now we're going to talk about avoiding commercial flooring issues from flooring selection. And I know contractors don't always select the floors, but you're the last one to touch it, and sometimes the first person to say, this is the wrong product, we're going to have a problem. Before we do that, another quick polling question. Who is responsible for researching, evaluating, and selecting products? Not you. It's the architect or designer. If a product doesn't work in a space, it's not the contractor's fault. It's not the builder's fault. It is the architect and design team, and that's according to CSI. That's in the contract documents, and that's in all the training that anybody who gets any kind of certification related to contract documents gets. Architect and design team are responsible for making sure everything works. If it doesn't work, it's their fault, and that's per the contract. So keep that in mind. Anyway, so which flooring belongs where? Commercial applications are tough. There's so many different things that you need to consider, that the architects need to consider. Does it need to be seamless or weldable? Does it need to be especially hygienic or antimicrobial? Does it need to be slip resistant? Does it need to be extremely durable? Does it need to be indentation resistant? Does it have a high static load limit? Does it need to be easy to clean and maintain? These are all different things that anybody involved with the project needs to keep in mind. So the first thing I would say, I say this to contractors all the time, make sure your product meets the specification. The specification is there to protect the contractors from bad manufacturing. So make sure that the product complies. There's a standard for every single product that you use. ASTM, to become a member, I think it's $75, $80 a year. and you get free standards you get a free copy of all the standards within F06, which is all of these standards and more. It's cheap insurance, and then you can reference these documents and say, hey, wait a minute, like this product, it's a very common in especially in vinyl products, but even in rubber products, that products clearly don't comply with the standard. And there is a rigid core standard, and there's a lot of products coming in offshore in rigid core that don't meet the standard. So it's really important to make sure that the product you're using meets it. It's a little extra research you can do on your side, because you know what, like it or not, no matter whose fault it is, if there's a problem, it costs everybody money, including you, even if it's not your fault. So flooring may be required to meet specific requirements, static load, sometimes used as a benchmark to see if products can withstand a certain weight without indentation. Coefficient of friction, this is determining slip resistance, and then chemical resistance, especially in healthcare, or laboratories, but mainly healthcare. They're usually going to ask if there's specific chemicals that this product can withstand. A lot of times contractors end up having to gather that information and submit it. And then flooring must be warranted for the space. And that's not something that contractors should have to worry about or deal with. But if you know a product is not rated for a space, don't install it. At least bring it to someone's attention, because, it's a claim waiting to happen, and it's going to take time, and time is money. So selecting proper adhesive, make sure the adhesive is appropriate for the substrate, especially if it's non-porous, if it's moisture mitigation, if it's a sound control underlayment like a rubber or a foam, if it's some sort of specialty underlayment or a specialty panel, make sure the adhesive is appropriate. That's an easy claim to deny for me. And then make sure the adhesive is appropriate for the flooring material. I can't count how many times somebody's tried to install something with carpet adhesive because there's a ton of carpet on the job and they just thought, it'll work. A lot of times it doesn't. This is especially important if there's more than one product type. But there's some flooring products that have specific requirements. Cork is a good example. Cork is a resilient flooring product. Might be made of wood, but it falls under our category. And then rubber. Usually rubber products have specific adhesive requirements. And PVC free flooring, notoriously hard to bond to. So they usually have specific adhesive requirements as well. Architects make mistakes in contract documents with adhesives. Just because it's in the document, do your research and make sure that it's compatible, because they'll try to tell you that you're the professional and should have known better. And then be aware of the final use of the space. If you know it's going to be real heavy use and you're using a really inexpensive light use adhesive, say something. If you know that the area is going to get a lot of UV IR exposure and you're using a pressure sensitive adhesive, you might want to double check that it's compatible. Heavy rolling loads, in areas that have heavy rolling loads, hill rod beds, stuff like that, there's going to be specific requirements. If you're using a trowelable acrylic adhesive, there might be problems down the line. And then wet areas, whether it's indoor or outdoor, usually a waterproof adhesive is going to be preferred in these situations. And then for products that don't require an adhesive, proper expansion, allow for proper expansion. Like I was saying, 50% of all click claims are related to substrate flatness. The other 50% are improper expansion. And there's all kinds of excuses that are used. Oh, the architect didn't want to use an overlap transition. They wanted to use a Schluter. They didn't want the gaps exposed around the door frames. Oh, we couldn't undercut the door frames because they're metal. Doesn't matter. You have to allow for proper expansion around the entire perimeter and all vertical surfaces. Around door jambs especially, that's a lot of times where flooring gets caught when it expands. And then use spaces and wedges to ensure the gap is honored. They're cheap. You can get like a 50 pack from Home Depot for $10 or something like that. And then expansion joints. So not concrete expansion joints, but expansion joints in the flooring. Like the picture on the left shows, a lot of flooring materials have a maximum length or width or area. Make sure you put an expansion joint in. I was in California last week denying a claim because they installed 130 feet of continuous flooring and it was failing. because they didn't put an expansion joint in. And then transitions. Make sure the transition allows for expansion. Schluter makes one transition that allows for expansion. If there's Schluter and it's click, there's a problem. Most rubber and vinyl manufacturers don't allow for expansion. There's a small offering that does. Flooring manufacturers should have a recommendation for a transition that'll work, and a lot of times they're color coordinating, but if they don't, it's on you to make sure that, because once it's installed by you, they're going to go to you and say, why did you do it? And then perform proper maintenance before turnover. You're not responsible typically for long-term maintenance, but that initial turnover is huge. And when we talk about gypsum dust and stuff like that, if it's not clean when you turn it over or they have a problem afterwards, you're still going to go back and have to deal with it every time. So use manufacturing recommended maintenance methods, and then follow the heavy cleaning instructions if you think you have a problem. Every manufacturer is going to have some sort of instructions of if you've got a problem, if it's not getting clean, if there's heavy dirt accumulation, however they word it. Make sure you follow because every manufacturer has them, especially if there's adhesive on the surface or if you've got gypsum dust on the surface. Gypsum dust is really, really hard to remove. You have to agitate the surface of the floor and remove the dust all in one fell swoop. If you just try and damp mop it, it's just spreading it, and it'll take 6-7 times before you get it all up. Whereas if you use an auto scrubber or use a dual mop bucket system or something that actually removes stuff from the floor, that's a way that you'll get that up. Share important documents with the end users. Maintenance documents are a no-brainer, but one thing I really emphasize to contractors is make sure you share proper floor protection. I know that no contractor is responsible for putting the floor protection devices on the chairs and the tables, but share that information with the end user, because end users are usually pretty frustrated when they have all this new furniture and it's all made with nylon that is just getting torn apart because the nylon is weaker than the floor that they're putting over it, and there's no wax on it. So it's got there's more friction between the two surfaces. And a lot of times what happens, the nylon breaks up, it accumulates underneath, it's usually black nylon, so it builds up on the surface and it just looks gross. And, it's not entirely a maintenance issue. It's literally just the nylon is not rated for most resilient flooring products. So share that with the end user. And then the warranty, especially exclusions. There's exclusions in most warranties that tie directly to end use, not just you as the contractor, what you're supposed to do, how it's supposed to be installed, but also what kind of abuse it can take, what kind of loads it can take. A lot of times that's in the warranty. And for you to prevent the callback and having to deal with it, make sure that the end user is aware of what those exclusions are, because they may do things to the floor that you're not aware of. And that happens a lot, especially with floating floor and anchoring stuff to it, or, putting transitions in that don't allow for expansion. If they're, take some of these points and some of the common problems that you have and use our warranties to protect you from the end user. When flooring products, installation methods, and maintenance procedures are properly specified, implemented, and installed, the result is beautiful, well-protected commercial flooring installations that will last for years to come. So that's the end of my presentation. Hussein had a question. So what do you recommend to contractors when the customer selects all of the material and you are only there for labor and notice that the glue that the customer selected is low quality and will cause failures? Notify the customer and they say, no, we want you to use this material. That's a great question, and I'm not sure that there's one right answer. Some people would say get a release of lien or some sort of release of liability. I've heard that the enforceability of those is tricky depending on where you are. But yeah, I've dealt with this before where contractor says, hey, they're trying to make us use this glue. Can you help us out? And then jump on a conference call with, GC, the end user, architect, whoever is involved. And usually what I say in those situations is, you can install this, but I'm going to tell you what your limitations are. Like, here's what could happen, and here's what we're not going to cover. And by the way, I know this job name now, so it's going to be really easy for me to reference later on when I search in my email and find the follow-up email I sent saying, hey, don't use this glue, and here's why. One thing I try to say, very little actually voids a warranty. You can't say, oh, you used a third-party adhesive, you have no warranty. It's not true, and it's been thrown out. That ideology has been thrown out in court time and time again. But one thing you can say is if you use a third-party adhesive, we'll still cover the manufacturing defect part of the warranty, and we'll still cover the wear part of the warranty. But if there are any issues related to adhesion, they will not be covered. And that's Hussein, that's what I would say in that scenario, is saying if there's a problem with the flooring and it's related to the adhesive, you're not going to have any coverage from the manufacturer on this. You know, if there's a defect, you can make an argument there. If there's a wear claim, there's an argument there. But if they select an adhesive and something goes wrong because of that selection, that's going to fall back on them. And like I said, architects, according to every contract document, they're responsible for making those selections. So they have to deal with the consequences from those selections. Any other questions?
Thank you so much, Graham. If the audience has any more questions, please be sure to submit them now in the question box on the left hand of your screen. We'll wait for a moment. It doesn't appear that there are any additional questions, Graham. So if there aren't any more questions, then on behalf of FCICA, thank you so much, Graham, for presenting today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you everyone for attending. I know it was a lot of information, but I tried to give you a succinct picture of what we see on the manufacturing side. So thanks for getting through that with me.
And I just want to also add, SIMs may now navigate to the Submit Credit tab to receive credit. Please note that you must be signed into the education platform for this feature to work. If you have any issues, please let us know. This is the conclusion of the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.